With that, I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to the chairman of the House Ethics Committee, my good friend from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, George Santos has built his persona, his personal and political life, on a foundation of lies. Many of those lies are well documented. We know that Mr. Santos lied about his education, both graduate and postgraduate, claiming that he attended universities where he was never enrolled, claiming that he obtained degrees that he did not earn. We know that Mr. Santos lied about his employment when he claimed that he worked for two prestigious financial institutions, Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. We know that Mr. Santos lied about his religious faith when he said he was Jewish, and then later when called out said he meant to say he was Jew-ish. And we know that Mr. Santos lied when he said that he had 4 employees who were killed in a mass shooting in Florida. But Mr. Speaker, those lies, while troubling, those lies did not justify his removal from this body. But these and other misleading statements reflect directly on Mr. Santos's credibility. In May, Mr. Speaker, George Santos said that he looked forward to seeing the ethics process play out, and that if the committee finds reason to remove him, then that is the process. Today, Mr. Speaker, George Santos would have you believe that the process that he endorsed in May is fatally flawed, and that he instead is the subject of a political witch hunt. Mr. Santos has described the report issued by the Ethics Committee as slanderous. He said that if there was a single ounce of ethics in the Ethics Committee, they would not have released the biased report. He referred to the report as a political hit piece. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind you that in March of this year, George Santos promised to fully cooperate with the ethics investigation. That just weeks ago, Mr. Santos said, "I have been very cooperative since the investigation started, and that I have no plans to change that." But, Mr. Speaker, the record of the investigation reveals otherwise. The report of the Ethics Committee noted these things, Mr. Speaker. First, that Mr. Santos failed to submit a written response to the allegations filed by his fellow members. That Mr. Santos failed to provide many of the documents requested by the investigative subcommittee. That when given an opportunity to provide a statement under oath, that Mr. Santos denied to do so. That when asked to voluntarily testify, Mr. Santos refused. And the committee learned through his counsel that if the investigative subcommittee were to subpoena Mr. Santos, that he would plead the fifth and not give any testimony for fear that it may incriminate himself. And so while Mr. Santos has failed to speak with the committee, Mr. Speaker, he has spoken freely to the media. Just this past weekend, he was participating in a 3-hour live stream podcast with Monica Matthews. In that 3-hour interview, he said, "I've made it very clear I'm not running for re-election. It's not because it was a damning report. I'm not running because I don't want to work with a bunch of hypocrites. It's gross. I have colleagues who are more worried about getting drunk every night with the next lobbyist that they're going to screw and pretend none of us know what's going on and sell off the American people, not show up to vote because they're too hungover, whatever the reason is, or just not show up to vote at all and give their cards out like candy for someone else to vote for them." He went on to say regarding the ethics report, He said it's flawed. It was designed to smear me. It was designed to force me from my seat. That was the intention of the report. This wasn't a finding of fact. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a few minutes about the report of the investigative subcommittee, the report of the ethics committee, the work that they did over an 8-month period. And I will tell you that the findings of the committee were shocking. We know that the ethics committee authorized 37 subpoenas. They issued 43 requests for information. They interviewed 40 witnesses. They reviewed 172,000 pages of documents, and they issued a 56-page investigation report. In addition to this 56-page investigation report, Mr. Speaker, these are the exhibits that they attached to the investigative report. The 50-plus page report goes into great detail, and it paints a picture of the fraud committed by Santos. And in many cases, it also tracks the allegations for which Mr. Santos has been indicted in the Eastern District of New York. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the language of the report says this, that the investigative subcommittee revealed a complex web of unlawful activity involving Representative Santos's campaign, personal and business finances. It says that Representative Santos sought to fraudulently exploit every aspect of his House candidacy for his own personal profit. The report says that he blatantly stole from his campaign, that he deceived donors into providing what they thought were contributions to his campaign, but they were in fact payments for his personal benefit. The report goes on to say he reported fictitious loans to his political committees, to induce donors and party committees to make further contributions to his campaign. And then later the report says that despite Santos's efforts to blame his former treasurer for the numerous campaign violations, the ISC records demonstrates that Representative Santos knowingly and actively participated in this conduct. Mr. Speaker, through records that were subpoenaed by the Ethics Committee, we learned that Mr. Santos spent campaign-related funds on personal rent, on personal credit card payments, on ATM withdrawals. We know that he purchased luxury designer purchases at least 2 high-end stores. Then he spent money on payments made at OnlyFans. And that Mr. Santos spent almost $3,000 on Botox treatments. In addition to these questionable expenses, there were travel expenses, questionable expenses, involving trips to Atlantic City, Las Vegas, Nevada, and the Hamptons. Mr. Speaker, in addition to this, there was additional fraud that was uncovered and contained in this report issued by the Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee found that in 2020, that bank records indicate that Mr. Santos was repaid over $29,000 for fictitious loans that he never made his campaign. The report goes on to say that in 2021, that he falsely reported loaning his campaign $580,000, and he falsely reported loaning an additional $25,000 to his leadership PAC. The report goes on to document that the committee found, according to bank records, that Mr. Santos transferred $200,000 from Redstone Strategies, an entity found to be an unregistered super PAC controlled by Mr. Santos, that he transferred in 2022 alone over $200,000 into his personal account. Mr. Speaker, I know that some members of this body have expressed concern about due process. They believe that Mr. Santos was not given due process, therefore that this should not go forward. And Mr. Speaker, I want to address the argument of due process. Mr. Speaker, you are well aware that due process is referred to in the 5th and 14th Amendment. In the 5th Amendment, it says, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, or property without due process of law. We know the 14th Amendment then applies the 5th Amendment to the states, where it says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And then, as you are also well aware, the 6th Amendment talks about criminal proceedings and the rights that attach to a criminal proceeding. Mr. Speaker, we're not here today on a criminal proceeding. The rights of the 6th Amendment don't apply, but due process under the 5th and 14th Amendment do apply here at this proceedings. And so it is important to talk about due process. The due process that are contained in the 5th and 14th Amendment. If you study due process, Mr. Speaker, you'll know that there are two subsections, two components, if you will, two legs upon which due process must stand. That first subsection, that first leg, is substantive due process. What is substantive due process? Substantive due process asks this question: is there a right to bring the action in question? Mr. Speaker, I say that there is. And we know that that right exists because that right is found in the United States Constitution. The expulsion clause, which is found in Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, says this, Mr. Speaker. Says that each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of a 2/3 vote, expel a member. So, Mr. Speaker, I tell you that as it relates to substantive due process, that clearly substantive due process applies in this case. But that second leg, the second stool of due process, is procedural due process. Procedural due process is a process that it governs the fairness of the proceedings. And there are three primary requirements, three primary tenets of procedural due process. Those requirements are, first, was adequate notice given. And Mr. Speaker, I hold in this case adequate notice was given. Adequate notice was given in the fact that the investigative subcommittee notified Mr. Santos in February that the investigation was going to be ongoing. And it actually had contact with he and his office well before that, in January, shortly after he was sworn in. I would argue that Mr. Santos has notice of this hearing because the motion was filed 2 weeks ago. The resolution was filed to expel him from this body. So clearly, Mr. Santos has been given proper notice. The second requirement of due process says, did Mr. Santos have an opportunity to be heard? And Mr. Speaker, I will tell you that he has an opportunity to be heard. He had an opportunity repeatedly to be heard by the Ethics Committee. He had the opportunity to submit a written statement, which he refused to do so. He had an opportunity to submit a statement under oath. He refused to do so. He had an opportunity to come in and testify, and he declined to do so. Even when faced with the subpoena, he was planning to come in before the Ethics Committee and exercise his Fifth Amendment right not to testify. And so, Mr. Speaker, I hold that he has had ample opportunity to be heard by the investigative subcommittee. And he has once again presented the opportunity here today to, before this body, before the American people, he has the opportunity today to rebut the findings of the Ethics Committee. He has the opportunity to point out any errors or omissions that he claims are in the report. And so clearly, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Santos has had the opportunity to be heard. And then finally, the third and final point there is the opportunity to have a fair tribunal. And we are following the Constitution, which says that the body of other elected members, this body as a whole, must be the body that conducts a vote in this case. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind you of a statement I earlier referenced. That statement made by Mr. Santos in May. That statement where he said that he looked forward to seeing the ethics process play out. And if the ethics committee finds a reason to remove him, then that is the process. Mr. Speaker, the findings of the ethics committee. The ethics committee found substantial evidence, language taken directly from the report, substantial evidence that Representative Santos knowingly caused his campaign to file false or incomplete reports with the Federal Election Commission. The investigative subcommittee found substantial evidence that he used campaign funds for personal purposes. It found substantial evidence that he engaged in fraudulent conduct and connections with Redstone Strategies, LLC. And it found substantial evidence that Mr. Santos did knowingly and willfully engage in violations of the Ethics in Government Act. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask in accordance with Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, I would ask that all members vote to support the expulsion of Representative Santos, and I yield back.